Today we have some more actual history about the early settlement of Middle Tennessee. This episode picks up at the voyage of John Donelson and the party of settlers he was leading down the Tennessee River to the Ohio River and then to the Cumberland, which would lead them to Nashville. This group had already been attacked by Chickamauga Indians, and all those infected with smallpox who were on their own isolated boats were presumed dead. We will be reading from this book, Early History of Middle Tennessee, by Edward Albright. This book was published all the way back in 1908. So here is the story of the perilous end of this group's journey by river to the settlement that would eventually become Nashville. News of the fleet's approach seems to have preceded it down the river, and now at every turn the unhappy voyagers were greeted with signs of hostility. They had by this time reached the Whirl or Suck, 10 miles down from Chattanooga, where the river is compressed into less than half its usual channel by the jutting walls of the Cumberland Mountains. While passing through the Boiling Pot near the upper end of these narrows, an accident occurred which almost cost the immigrants their lives. John Cotton had attached a large canoe in which he was traveling to Robert Cartwright's flatboats, on which his household goods were stored, and into the latter Cotton and his family had gone for greater safety. At this point, the canoe was overturned and its cargo lost. Pitying Cotton's distress, those ahead decided to call a halt and help recover the property. They landed at a level spot on the north bank, and were going back to the scene of the accident when, to their utter surprise, the Indians appeared in great numbers on the opposite cliffs above, and began firing down on them. The would-be rescuers beat a hasty retreat to their boats, and shoving off rode rapidly down the river. The Indians lining the bluffs overhead kept up a brisk fire, during which 4 of the immigrants were wounded. In the boat of Russell Gower was his daughter, Nancy Gower. When the crew was thrown into disorder by the attack, Nancy took the helm, and steered through the narrows though exposed to all fire of the enemy. A bullet from an Indian's rifle passed entirely through her body, but she made no outcry, standing bravely at her post. No one knew she was wounded until her mother discovered the bloodstains on her garments. She survived the wounds and became the wife of Anderson Lucas, one of the first settlers of Nashville. It would seem that the events above recorded were enough for one day, but the end was not yet. A boat belonging to Jonathan Jennings ran onto a large rock, jutting out into the water at the lower end of the whirl. The enemy soon discovered Jennings' plight, and turning their whole attention to him, kept up a most galling fire on his boat and its occupants. He immediately ordered his wife, a son nearly grown, a young man who was a passenger, and 2 black servants, a man and a woman, to throw all the goods into the river, that they might thus lighten the craft and get it afloat. Jennings himself, being a good soldier and a fine marksman, took up his rifle and returned the fire of the Indians with great effect. Before the boat was unloaded, his son, the young man who was a passenger, and the black man jumped overboard, and started to swim ashore. The black man was drowned, but the 2 young men reached the bank where they secured a canoe, and started down the river. Mrs. Jennings and the black woman continued their work of unloading the boats, assisted by Mrs. Peyton, a daughter of Mrs. Jennings, and the wife of Ephraim Peyton, who had gone overland with Robertson. An infant, to which Mrs. Peyton had given birth only the day before this disaster, was accidentally killed in the confusion and excitement incident to unloading the boat. When the goods were all thrown overboard, Mrs. Jennings got out and shoved the boat off the rocks. In so doing, she nearly lost her life because of its sudden lurch into the water. History has seldom recorded deeds of greater heroism than those accredited to the brave women who were among the immigrants on this most memorable voyage to a new and unknown land. The 2 young men who deserted the boat were met on their way down the river by 5 canoes full of Indians. By the latter they were taken prisoners and carried back to one of the Chickamauga towns. There young Jennings was knocked down by the Indians who were about to take his life, when a friendly trader by the name of Rogers came up and ransomed him with goods and trinkets. He was afterwards restored to his relatives at the French Lick settlement. The other captive was killed, and his body burned. All other boats of the fleet were ahead of that of Jennings, and though their occupants feared for its safety, they were ignorant of its peril. They had proceeded without incident during Wednesday night, and after sailing all day Thursday, March 9th, considered themselves beyond the reach of danger, and camped at dusk on the northern shore. About 4 o'clock next morning they were aroused by a cry of help from the river. Upon investigation, it was found that the call was from the Jennings boat, whose occupants were drifting downstream in a most wretched condition. They had discovered the whereabouts of their fellow travelers by the light of the campfires ashore. It was little short of miraculous that they should have escaped without the slightest wounds, as their boat and even the clothing they wore had been pierced by many bullets. The members of this unfortunate family having now been distributed among the remaining boats, the voyage was resumed. After a day of safe passage, the fleet anchored again at night on the northern shore. On March 12th, they came to the upper end of Muscle Shoals, near the present site of Tuscumbia, Alabama. Here we remember it had been agreed that a party from French Lick should either meet them or leave a sign which should determine their future course. Doubtless the commanders of this flotilla and the company they were leading looked forward with a sense of relief to a probable journey from this point overland, by which they might escape the further perils of the river. In this, however, they were doomed to disappointment, for upon their arrival at the heads of the shoals, neither the party nor the promised sign were in evidence. Colonel Robertson's reason for not fulfilling this part of the agreement is unknown. A probable explanation is that because of the unexpected length of his own journey, he supposed the river party had already passed the shoals by the time he reached French Lick. Nevertheless, the crews of the flotilla, though well aware of the dangers confronting them, were determined to continue the voyage. The shoals are described as being at that time dreadful to behold. The river was swollen beyond its wont, the swift current running out in every direction from piles of driftwood, which were heaped high upon the points of the islands. This deflection of the stream made a terrible roaring, which might be heard for many miles. At some places the boats dragged the bottom, while at others they were warped and tossed about on the waves as though in a rough sea. The passage, which was withal exceedingly dangerous, was made in about 3 hours, the entire fleet coming through into the western channel of the river without accident. 2 days later, some of the boats coming too near the shore were fired upon by the Indians, and 5 of the crew were wounded. That night, after having gone into camp near the mouth of a creek in Hardin County, Tennessee, the party became alarmed by the loud barking of their dogs, and supposing that the enemy was again upon them, ran hastily down to the river, leaving all the camp outfit behind. Springing into the boats, they drifted in the darkness about a mile downstream, and camped again on the opposite shore. Next morning, John Donelson Jr. and John Caffrey, who seemed to have been the scouts of the expedition, determined to find out the cause of alarm. Securing a canoe, they rowed back to the first camp, where they found an old black man, a member of the party, sound asleep by the fire. In the hurried flight of the night before, no one had thought to wake him, and he was yet undisturbed by the rays of the morning sun. The alarm was false, for nothing had been molested. The party now returned and gathered up their belongings, after which another day's voyage was begun. On Monday night, March 20th, they arrived at the mouth of the Tennessee River, and went into camp on the lowland which is the site of Paducah. Though already much worn by hunger and fatigue, the supply of provision having run short, they were here confronted by new difficulties, the whole making the situation extremely disagreeable. Having been constructed to float with the tide, their boats were unable to ascend the rapid current of the Ohio, which was almost out of banks by reason of the heavy spring rains. They were also ignorant of the distance yet to be traveled, and the length of time required to reach their destination. Some of the company here decided to abandon the journey to French Lick, a part of them floating down the Ohio and Mississippi to Natchez, the rest going to points in Illinois. Among the latter were John Caffrey and wife, the son-in-law and daughter of Colonel Donelson. This loss of companionship made a continuation of the voyage doubly trying on those who were left behind. However, nothing daunted, they determined to pursue their course eastward, regardless of all the danger. Accordingly, they set sail on Tuesday the 21st, but were 3 days in working their way up the Ohio from Paducah to the mouth of the Cumberland, a distance of 15 miles. Arriving at the latter place, they were undecided as to whether the stream they found was really the Cumberland. Some declared it could not be the latter, because it was very much smaller in volume than they had expected to find. Probably their 3 days of incessant toil against the swift current of the Ohio had much to do with this pygmy in appearance of our own beloved and historic river. However, they had heard of no stream flowing into the Ohio between the Tennessee and Cumberland, and therefore decided to make the ascent. They were soon assured by the widening channel that they were correct in their conjectures. In order to make progress upstream, Colonel Donelson rigged the Adventure with a small sail made out of a sheet. To prevent the ill effects of any sudden gusts of wind, a man was stationed at each lower corner of this sail with instructions to loosen it when the breeze became too strong. For 3 days after entering the mouth of the Cumberland, their journey was without incident. An occasional hunting excursion was made through the forest which skirted the shore. Thus was procured a supply of buffalo meat, which was poor but palatable. On the second day out, a large swan came floating by the Adventure. Colonel Donelson shot it and describes the cooked flesh thereof as having been very delicious. 2 days later they gathered from a place in the bottoms near the shore a quantity of greens which some of the company called Shawnee salad. To this day the spot above named is known as Pat's Injun Patch, so named for Colonel Donelson's old black cook, Patsy, who was called Pat for short. On Friday, March 31st, they had the good fortune to meet Colonel Henderson of the Transylvania Company, who was out with a surveying party trying to establish the much-disputed boundary line between Virginia and North Carolina. This meeting was very timely as Colonel Henderson had come over by way of French Lick, and brought them good tidings of the arrival of Colonel Robertson and his companions, from whom they had not heard since the latter began their perilous westward march over the Kentucky Trail 5 months before. Until late in the night they plied him with questions about the new country toward which they were journeying. He painted in glowing colors the future before them, and by way of relieving anxiety as to the present needs vouchsafed the information that he had just purchased a quantity of corn from the settlements in Kentucky to be shipped by boat from Louisville to French Lick, for the use of the settlers. Doubtless there was then a silver lining to the cloud of uncertainty that had hovered over this hardship-ridden band of adventurers, but there was yet 3 weeks of sailing before them. At length they arrived without further accident at the mouth of Red River in Montgomery County, where they bade adieu to Isaac Renfro and several companions, the latter having on a previous hunting trip selected a location at that place. The voyage was now near an end, and on April 23rd they found themselves alongside of Eaton Station, a mile and a half below the Bluff Fort. The following day, Monday, April 24th, they joined their relatives and friends of the Robertson expedition, from whom they had parted many weeks before. Colonel Donelson records the fact that it was then a great source of satisfaction to himself and his associates that they were now able to restore to Colonel Robertson and others their families and friends, whom some time since perhaps they had despaired of ever meeting again. 33 of the party had perished by the way, and 9 of those who remained were wounded. Truly has Gilmore said, "This voyage has no parallel in history. 1,000 miles they had journeyed in frail boats upon unknown and dangerous rivers. The country through which they had passed was infested by hostile Indians, and their way had been over foaming whirlpools and dangerous shoals, where for days they had run the gauntlet and been exposed to the fire of the whole nation of Chickamaugas, the fiercest Indian tribe on this continent. In all events, it will stand forth to the end of time as one of the most remarkable achievements in the early settlements of the American continent." So that's it for this episode. This is the third in our series on the early history of Middle Tennessee. These were some of the very first large groups of Tennessee settlers, and this river party took a roundabout way from Fort Patrick Henry to Nashville. This party had the most difficulty just south of Chattanooga, near what is known as the Suck. The Suck would inhibit the growth of eastern Tennessee for many years, because it prevented the Tennessee River from being navigable both ways, and Chickamauga Indians often preyed on the boats passing by. Eventually, a dam named Hales Bar Dam was built a few miles below the Suck, and it opened in 1913. This caused the river to rise upstream, and the Suck was gone. I was able to find a record of Mrs. Peyton's infant who died in the skirmish with the Indians. He was named after his father, Ephraim Peyton, and he was born on March 7, 1780, and died the very next day. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is now viewed as unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Those channels are more interested in covering the history of food than the history of Tennessee. But here on this channel we keep this worthy history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission here at Unworthy History, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. For $5 per month, you will have access to members-only videos, and your support will also be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.